Welcome to a special interview episode of the Georgia Politics Podcast. I'm your host, Preston Thompson. We are so excited in studio today to have Mayor of Columbus, Teresa Tomlinson, also the Democratic candidate, as of right now, the only Democratic candidate for United States Senate for currently Senator David Perdue's seat. Mayor Tomlinson, thank you so much for joining us.
It's really great to be here. Thank you, Preston.
I want to start where this whole thing started and talk about, beginning with something that I'm sure is still fresh in your mind, the process that you went through to sit down and decide, I want to run for U.S. Senate. I'm sure it takes, some form of audacity to know that I want to be there, that I belong there. So I'm curious about what your process was in that, who you talked to.
Sure. Well, a couple of things. One, I never really intended to run for successive office. I ran for mayor of Columbus because I felt that my community needed the particular type of leadership I could offer at that time. And then I intended to go back to the practice of law, which I have a deep passion for. About 15 months ago now, I had been approached about running for statewide office, had declined an opportunity to do that for what would then become the 2018 election because I wanted to finish out my term in Columbus. And I started then thinking, well, perhaps I should look at a statewide run. I knew that David Perdue was particularly vulnerable, and that has turned out to be true. He's currently at 31% against a generic Democrat. And, of course, the other favorables related to Trump are pretty tepid. Trump is between 37 and 43% in the state of Georgia for approval rating. And so in any event, as a Politico, someone who's been in Democratic politics for 30 years, I started looking at this and looking at the math that somebody running from outside the metro Atlanta area would really cut into their rural strategy. If we did all that we had learned in 16 and 18, replicated that as Democrats, and then came in strong with a non-metro Atlanta candidate who had great name recognition and a reputation in Central and South Georgia, the math made it almost impossible for a Republican to win, thereby piquing my interest in running. So I, of course, my husband and I are quite the team, and he practices law, and we did not marry until after I had made partners. So he's very used to me doing sort of bold things and being out there when it comes to leadership. So he was all in from the beginning. Started making calls to leaders around the state to see what they thought about it, and continued to get encouragement. And so I guess it was May 1, we filed for our candidacy in this race.
When people in Georgia look at the United States Senate, especially recently with some of the disaster relief funding that took something like 7 months to come through, they see something that's deadlocked and they see something that's broken. And a lot of people in Georgia don't blame that on either party. They see everyone, the body itself, is at fault. You are campaigning right now a lot on your ability to get things done. And I think some people have a hard time believing the Senate can be saved. Are there things you're hoping to do when you get there, or maybe just the way you carry yourself as a senator that would help break some of that deadlock?
Yeah. Well, you've really put your finger on it. I mean, the problem in the U.S. Senate is dysfunction. You turn on the TV and it looks like it's the World Wrestling Federation, not the United States Senate. And so what has happened is the world's most deliberative body, which is our U.S. Senate, it has always been considered the upper chamber, the world's think tank, has now devolved into this organization of people who are addicted to the fight. And so whenever a challenge comes up, they look at it as, how can I rev up my base and how can I demean my opponent, and not how can we get this resolved. And so in order to address that, you have to change the ethos of the organization. And you mentioned that I spend a lot of time talking about how I might be able to do that. And I do have, my life circumstances led me to have a fairly extraordinary life experience from being a trial lawyer, practicing in almost exclusively in the federal courts as someone who specialized in complex litigation. It was my job to turn trains around, to take things that were a huge mass of tangled yarn and figure out how to bring justice to it expeditiously. So I didn't specialize in banking law or aviation law. I did all of that because my specialty was bringing function from dysfunction, pulling victory from the jaws of defeat. That's when other lawyers would call me into cases. And so I did that for 16 years, and that's what made me run for office. And in Columbus, in fact, I remember the chief of police, who was a good friend of mine. I was public safety director. He called me one day and he said, "Is there any third rail of Columbus politics you are not going to touch?" And I said, "No," because that's the point of leadership. And so I brought that to Columbus by reforming our pension plan that had been locked in a political quagmire forever. When I came in, it was 74% funded. When I left, it was over 96% funded. We had an even more robust pension plan, but we saved the taxpayers $55 million. That does not happen by accident. You have to be somebody that has a strategic mind, that knows how to work with people who are in incredible deadlock. And I say this very carefully because I think a lot of folks say, well, I can work with people on both sides of the aisle. That's great. A lot of people can do that, and that's a wonderful attribute to have. I can do that too. I also am a street fighter, but I always keep my eye on the solution for the people I represent. And I think people miss that sometimes. They get addicted to the fight, and they're never looking for the solution. So the point of the fight, the point of the effort is always to win people's hearts and minds. If you have to fight, fine. But what is your strategy to win people's hearts and minds to drive them towards a solution? I know that sounds very conceptual, but frankly, it's a model that fits almost every type of dysfunction, whether it's in an aviation case in federal court or loan home fraud, mortgage fraud case, or whether it's pension reform or reducing crime by 42% or dramatically reducing homelessness or any of the things that we did, reforming our budget in Columbus. Those things were fraught with political ego, with long entrenched positions, and you have to have a long-term strategic mind and an ethos of I'm here to solve this.
Do you think having a history of executive experience gives you a unique perspective on that? Because, if the Senate fails to do something, people in most cases are still going to get their water and still going to get their power. But a lot of times if a mayor fails to do something, the consequences can be a little bit different.
Exactly.
Do you think that gives you a unique perspective?
Yeah, it does. Because the buck always stops with the executive, right? And so as an executive, you have a very keen interest of the importance of government as a tool to solve things. You have a very keen interest that we have to govern and govern well. And so that's my record as mayor. Now, a lot of people say, well, what does executive experience translate to legislative experience? If you understand and respect government as being us, it's not something that sits on a hill in Washington, D.C. It is the people. That is the point of our democracy, is the consent of the governed. So our government is us. If you understand that, then government is the organization through which we do amazing things. And I think an executive has a very particular idea and set of circumstantial experiences which allow them to understand how important the legislature is, because what you can get them to deliver to you and then therefore you can sign off on, executing your vision through a legislature, which in my instance was 10 very independent people and sometimes very conservative people. You understand and respect the role of a legislature. At the same time, when you flip that script, a legislator has an immense responsibility to get the workings right, to deliver it to the executive to be signed off on. And if you can't, as I said before, immediately win the hearts and minds of the executive, then your objective is to box them in so it has to be politically palatable to them, or the alternative is not politically palatable to them. And that takes a very strategic mind. So yes, mayors know how to run government because people demand it of them and they have a respect for it.
Let's get to some issues that are probably going to come up over the next couple of years. I want to start with what's probably most in the news right now, which is Georgia joining several other states, some in the Southeast here, with pro-life legislation. Do you think as a senator, there's a role the federal government can play? And I know I'm sure you're probably hoping to serve under or alongside a Democratic president and maybe a Democratic Senate, Democratic House. Do you think there's a role for them to play in inserting some sort of authority over the states into that, or is it more of what you said, a campaign of hearts and minds to change individual legislatures?
No, actually, there's several things we can and must do at the federal level, because I think we've seen now that states are abusing what power and authority the federal government and frankly, the court system had allowed them to have under our existing laws. But they have abused it. They've gone too far, and they've basically infringed upon a woman's basic bodily autonomy, which is a fundamental part of the equality and freedom set forth in the United States Constitution. So when you have states that are running afoul of basic human rights, basic bodily autonomy for women, then what you have is the federal government has a role to protect that baseline. And what they're doing, interestingly, is they're meddling in the unauthorized practice of medicine. It is highly individualized, these circumstances. And they're making these broad legislative edicts of every woman's particular health and life circumstance. And so it is a subject matter that is particularly inappropriate for legislation. It is a subject matter that is highly scientific or individualized related to the medical care, and they have no expertise to proclaim those particular rules. And it is an incredibly emotional and private circumstance. All of that makes it unworthy of state legislative effort. So we see them messing around in it, mucking it up pretty good, and violating people's basic constitutional rights. So what's the role of the federal government? The role of the federal government is twofold. One, we're going to have to initiate some basic federal legislation that provides that women have the right to their own bodily autonomy, and that women have a basic right to privacy, freedom, and equality, including their own health care. And secondly, we're going to have to address the Hyde Amendment, which basically provides a disproportionate monetary harmful impact to women of lesser means, people who need federal assistance through Medicaid and some Medicare programs to provide for basic obstetric and gynecological care. And so that has been used as a weapon against women that have lesser resources. And I can't think of any worse thing to do than take someone who is already struggling and beat them up about their most private choices and particularized health care. And I think we need to remember that. And I speak often about this from a faith-based circumstance as well. I don't cede that ground. My faith is very clear, and that is that we women are divinely made. We are the givers of life, and that is a fiduciary responsibility that has been handed to us. Women innately take that very, very seriously, and yet there are very difficult decisions that they must make, and that is nowhere in any religious text I have ever seen been delegated to a legislative body, a secular legislative body. So if there's legislative bodies out there who think that indeed they are the ones to be making these decisions, then the federal government's going to have to step in and legislatively provide a baseline of basic human rights for women.
So House Bill 481 here in Georgia essentially moved the line to 6 weeks,
yes,
which Democrats argue against that line because of scientific merits and other merits. The line before that was, I believe, around 20 weeks.
20 weeks.
So, often in politics, when an issue is looked at as black and white, it's often not. But I'm curious if, in your perspective, the line at all is an overreach of government, and that a line just shouldn't exist and that should still be left up to patients and doctors, or if there is a line drawn, like at the 20 weeks, for example, if we went back to that, how this conversation would change.
Yeah, what you're proposing is basically a libertarian and small conservative government proposal. I mean, that's the irony of this thing. Where are all the libertarians and the small government conservatives joining us in outrage of this overreach? And the fact of the matter, when you talk about 20 or 24 weeks, which is a very serious matter, there are so few abortions ever performed at those late stages. And when they are, the circumstances are so extraordinary and so traumatic For instance, a woman who's pregnant with twins and who has maybe mortgaged her house to engage in reproductive assistance with her husband, and they desperately want these twins, and they have gone through that journey of reproductive assistance, only to find out that one twin is non-viable, has some sort of circumstance, a vascular defect that prevents it from survival outside the womb. And the fact that it is at peril in that way and will perhaps not live to even have the opportunity to be born, puts the other twin at risk and puts the mother's life at risk. Now you say, well, that's accepted. They write it into law that it's accepted at a district attorney's discretion after they've had an investigation as to whether or not they, in retrospect, believe that the child could or could not have lived. Those are horrific decisions that women have to make to save one child that they're carrying. That's why I believe, as I said, that women are the divine fiduciaries of this decision, and no government can second guess that. So I appreciate your libertarian and small government conservative a view on this, which is how in God's name is a secular government any better at making these decisions on a broad public policy standpoint than a woman and her doctor. And they gin up a lot of this, frankly, to reach a severe emotionalism, to pit us against each other basically for election time. It's a get out the vote mechanism for elected Republican officials, and they use our most innate human compassion against us as a tool to acquire power, elected power, and I find it offensive.
Keeping us in healthcare.
Yes.
The presidential primary has showed a wide range of ways to address healthcare problems in this country. I'm curious of where you fall on the spectrum, if you have a specific approach that you'd like to see once in the Senate, and how you would address some of the problems we have specifically here in Georgia, like big healthcare deserts and several counties not having a single hospital bed.
Yeah. A couple things. One, I unabashedly support universal health care. We should have done it long ago. And the great thing about where we are now is that there are actually a lot of well-studied proposals on the table about what we can do for universal health care, which is to be distinguished from a single payer system. It's not to say that on down the road someday, single payer might be a possibility, but universal health care is my objective, and here's how we can do it. Just some of the proposals that are on the table that I think you can find consensus for. One is expanding Medicare to 55, and so that you're taking some of the most costly participants out of the free market, which then, of course, would allow private insurers to reduce their premiums for those who are under 55. It also would benefit Medicare because you'd be bringing younger and healthier people into Medicare. So that's one proposal that actually we could do with our current administrative construct. And the price tag for that has been estimated and is frankly something that's quite doable and shows a return of savings that has already been calculated by the studies that have been done. And that proposal's been around for about 2 decades. The other is to put Medicare on the exchange as an option, on the ACA exchange as an option, which is quite popular because there's 160 million people that have private insurance, and most of those like it just fine. And so you would run into a political buzzsaw with attempting a single payer healthcare plan that would keep this issue unsolved for another 15 years. It's too cataclysmic to the economic system, to the healthcare provider system, to suggest such a tremendous change in a short period of time. So putting Medicare on the exchange as an option is a wonderful way to take another step towards a universal healthcare system, but then also seeing if whether on down the road we could incrementally move towards a single payer system. I think that's yet to be fully analyzed, frankly. And so those are just some, one of the biggest things is that people are sick of the high prescription costs. And we have real solutions for that. I mean, we've looked at leveraging our buying power as a government for Medicaid and Medicare patients, which would drastically drive down prescription costs. We could utilize other things. There's been some programs we could cherry pick in places such as Canada about how we might be able to drive down prescriptions cost, and yet we do nothing like that. So it's time to begin eating this elephant one bite at a time and implementing some of these fundamental type changes that could bring universal health care about very, very quickly. And what I mean by that is that every citizen would have access to full and meaningful health care.
Sure. So moving on, I'm going to cheat here for a second and steal
Yes.
a question I saw from the New York Times
Yes.
that I found very interesting. But in an ideal world, would anyone own handguns? We
Yeah.
can limit it to the United States,
Sure.
obviously. In an
Yeah.
ideal world, would anyone in the United States own handguns?
Well, in an ideal world, there would be no fear and no hate, right? So you would have no reason to have to protect yourself against anything, even against animals. And I guess this perfect world you've proposed. And so there would be very little, if any, need for a handgun. I accept it. I see and accept your premise. I will say, interestingly, because my father is one, that there are folks who are gun enthusiasts who collect guns. There are actually, like there are fishing shows, there are actually gun shows on cable networks, and you can watch 1 hour of people talking about a particular gun, what it is composed of, how it was made, how it's balanced, how it fits in your hand, how it's loaded, how it shoots, how it recoils. It's amazing, but there are people who are quite enthusiastic about the mechanisms of firing a gun. And in that instance, and in the perfect world that you're talking about, they may have their hobby in places like gun ranges and gun clubs and things such as that. So I think that there is a fabulous balance, and I love to see your world absent of hate and fear, where people do not live in the ready of believing they have to defend themselves all the time.
In our current not idealized world,
Right,
to bring it home,
Yeah.
would you support drawing a line somewhere that would maybe ban assault weapons or high capacity magazines, these sort of steps that you can take to limit gun violence?
Yeah, I support the majority of American people in believing in reasonable restrictions to gun ownership. We have to have responsible gun ownership, and it starts with not having assault weapons. Now, again, for those people who are gun enthusiasts, they may have an assault weapon that is checked into or that they may rent from a firing range of some sort. They can be a member of a club, but there's no reason for those weapons to be out on the street. And as a former public safety director in Columbus, Georgia, I can tell you those weapons put the life of police officers on the line, and they put the lives of the people they protect on the line. And so, yes, an assault weapons ban, as well as reasonable background checks and closing these loopholes. I support H.R. 8, which is, I think, now been passed by the Congress, will not get a hearing in the Senate. And that's one reason why we need to send me to Senate and send David Perdue packing. But the American people broadly agree on reasonable gun restrictions and on responsible gun ownership. And amazingly, gun owners agree on responsible gun ownership. And so there is a happy median here.
So you mentioned not even a certain resolution, not even get a hearing in the Senate.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you are elected into a Senate that has a Democratic majority, so that would mean a couple states in our area, Georgia, probably South Carolina, swing some seats that way. Are there measures you would take or you would ask Senate leadership to take, maybe Chuck Schumer, to change the leadership style of Mitch McConnell and actually make sure bills maybe that aren't going to pass still get hearings?
Yeah.
I'm curious, Mitch McConnell has taken certain steps in his power. Are there ones that you might undo or ask to be undone?
Yeah. Well, one of the things we have to do is begin to look at the rules of the Senate, particularly those that were put in place so very long ago when things were different. And perhaps there was more statesmanship than there is today. But the rules of the Senate have been used to game the system. And so I think one of the things that I very much looking forward to doing when I get to the Senate is to rethink those rules, everything from the filibuster and, no longer having a supermajority requirement for things that does add to the volatility, however, and wide swings in public policy and legislative policy. And so I think it has to be thoughtfully considered. But nevertheless, I think you're absolutely right. We have to begin to completely rethink the rules of the Senate, or we're simply going to be reliving this Groundhog Day that we're presently in of complete dysfunction. So it would be nice if we could send people such as myself to the U.S. Senate who would be thinking about more than their next election, who would be thinking about what is the system that serves the American people regardless of who is in power.
Was there a time in your private law practice or your time as mayor where you weren't able to accomplish everything you wanted to accomplish? You failed in some aspect, and how did that influence the next time you approached a similar problem going forward?
Yeah. First of all, I never say failure, I say near miss. So
I'm going to start using that as well.
It's sort of a glass half full kind of approach to life.
Sure.
But sure, and I also think that a lot of times the objective of leadership is to attempt to correct a challenge, a dysfunction, if you will. And in doing that, you may not succeed completely, but to use a sports analogy, you may move the ball 10, 15 yards. And that's important too, because the next person who's going to run the ball is going to have is going to have the ability to leap off of your progress. And so one of the things that occurred in Columbus is we have a horrible tax system. It's called a property tax freeze. It sounds wonderful. I mean, it just sounds like something you would just run and sign up for, and we've had it for a really long time, and it's been absolutely devastating to low-income families, to people who rent, to people, everybody, frankly, new home buyers, people who want to, size up because they're having kids, people who want to downsize because perhaps their kids are gone and their spouse passed away and they no longer need 4 bedrooms and 3 baths. But it's a system that, quote unquote, freezes your tax rate at the or tax value at the level at which you bought your house. Sounds fabulous. Most people buy and sell their house every 7 to 10 years. But the way this has actually worked is that now there are people that own homes that are worth $500,000, $1 million, and they're paying $600-700 in taxes. And there's somebody who has a house for $88,000 valued, and they're paying $3,000 in taxes or $2,500 in taxes. So what it allows people to do is hoard incredible property wealth and not pay taxes on it, while other people who are transferring homes every 7 to 10 years as they get married, have children, downsize, whatever it may be, they never get on the good side of the freeze. So we actually had a study conducted that showed that it is a 16% premium to purchase a home from a tax perspective in Columbus, Georgia, because of this ridiculous freeze. And it takes 14 years to pay off the premium. So you have to live in your house for at least 14 years to even begin getting the benefit of the freeze. And should you sell your house and buy another, it starts all over again. So unless you buy your dream house, unless you come out of college ready to buy that just awesome house that's going to fit your every circumstance for the rest of your life, you're going to be on the bad side of the freeze. So we teed it up. It had been teed up twice, lost 80-20. We teed it up 2016. Donald Trump was on the ballot, and all that was going on, and we lost 60-40. So I look at that as a 20-yard gain, okay? And now the ball's to the next generation, and they can take it from there. But it's frankly really close, and I truly believe it was something like only 19% of those under the age of 50 supported the freeze. So it was definitely something that older folks thought were a benefit to them. But the truth of the matter is, when you went in and asked some of those folks, they had, shut off their second floor, no longer used any of those guest rooms down there, turned the heat off and didn't run the air conditioning in those areas. And they lived basically in a couple of rooms. But the fear factor and change is a big thing. And it was the first time we'd ever done a study. So a lot of people had not heard that information, been able to digest the information. So that was something where we had a near miss. And but I'm so proud of the effort because it took a lot of political courage to do it, and it took a lot of stamina and transparency to stand in the breach and explain something that is profoundly boring and dry to people like taxes.
I like the near miss term. I'm
Yes.
going to take that into my
Thank
home
you.
life.
It's all important. It's all important.
As someone who hosts a show like this and who votes in the state of Georgia, access to our representatives, my legislators, and our representatives in Congress is really important to me. Are there steps you're hoping to take once elected to the Senate that make you more accessible to voters, maybe hosting more town halls, things like that?
You know, that is something interesting that David Perdue has been completely unavailable to his constituency. He's a rather remote fellow. So yes, when I was mayor of Columbus, Georgia, in fact, we were running the first time in 2010. We had 44 debates. They were all different formats and styles of debates, but it showed me that the people of Columbus, Georgia were hungry for access to the people who would hold that office. And so thereafter, I started having town halls basically once a quarter. We had 30 of them during my 8-year tenure. And it was 75 minutes of open mic. People could ask the mayor absolutely anything they wanted. And it was fabulous. Over 100 people showed up every single time we had it. And we would live stream it and run it over and over again. Of course, at the time, I ran 2 Facebook pages, 2 Twitter pages, and was fully engaged, had over 200 emails and messages a day, every day, and responded to all of them, either myself or the direction of somebody on my staff. I wanted people to have direct access to their mayor, and I think it empowers them, and I think it's what democracy is all about. So when it comes to the U.S. Senate, absolutely. I look forward to not only town halls, but small group meetings. Look, if folks want to have you there, and I understand being a senator is different than being a mayor.
Sure.
But you can make some time. Maybe you can't do them all. But every place does not have to be filling up the Commerce Club to, host the business leaders. That's great too, and I look forward to doing that. But it can be something where regular folk gather, and I look forward to that.
So I want to close here with asking about who are some of the role models in your life, some people you look to for inspiration and maybe growing up in your earlier career, who you look to for styles of leadership.
So many folks, but I have to start with my mom. She actually grew up in rank poverty in rural South Georgia. She was a product of generational poverty from South rural Georgia. And she didn't graduate from high school. She left high school at 16, married my dad, who was 19, moved to Iowa and took care of his elderly parents who were disabled at the time. And so when I look at what she did through the raw tenacity of a young woman who knew she wanted her life to be better, it is so inspirational. And she poured that into my sister and myself, that if she could move from where she was to where she allowed us to be, creating the environment we grew up in with she and my father, then what could we do? And that we had the responsibility to go from here. And so she was a role model of just strength and determination, and that anything is possible, regardless of the circumstances that you've been dealt. And, she worked a union job for 35 years, a blue-collar job, to make sure my sister and I went to college. So she's my role model as a woman who was an extraordinary mother, a woman that, had she had a college education, would been president of the United States. So we would have already had a first woman president. Her name would have been Diane Pike. But her life didn't deal her those cards. And so she's an incredible inspiration. And another, I could go on because there was not a formal mentoring program when I was in high school or college. That's something that came along a little later. And so you took your mentors everywhere you could. Some of them didn't even know they were your mentors. You just glommed onto them and followed them around and emulated them because they were successful and good and had big hearts and knew what they were doing. But my partner, Neil Pope, senior partner of my law firm, he was utterly fearless. And I remember one time we were about to launch into something that was quite perilous and risky from a legal standpoint, and take on a huge corporation for something that they deserve to be called out for. And I said, Neil, do you think we're doing the right thing here? I mean, we're tugging the tail of a tiger. And he said, look, I made it through the Marine Corps. Nothing these guys can deal me is going to scare me or whatever. And I just remember thinking, wow, that unabashed courage, that just the belief that what you're working for is so important. It doesn't matter what happens to you personally. You're just a vessel through which justice is going to happen. And I loved that, and I emulated that, and I continue to emulate that today, is that we're all just tools and vessels so that justice can be done.
Mayor Tomlinson, thank you for taking time this morning. We look forward to following your campaign and hopefully having you back on sometime when you're a little bit deeper into it. But thank you.
Thank you very much.
Done.
Yay.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic.